The Bolt Report. Now, Andrew Bolt.
Welcome to the show. Tony Abbott will, in a speech tonight, cut loose. He'll be in Melbourne to a meeting of global warming skeptics, and he'll tell the Turnbull government to get serious on cutting electricity prices. Now, that won't surprise anyone, of course, but he will also attack the Paris Agreement that we've signed up to and say Australia should now tear it up. Now, that may not mean much at all to you, but we are in fact talking about an agreement to force global warming policies on the whole world, supposedly, but on us particularly. These are policies that put us in chains. They force up your electricity prices higher and higher, and that makes pensioners now too scared to even put on the heating. I'll give you some background. The polls show that there's not much that gets voters as angry as electricity prices. And just look, who can blame you? I mean, electricity prices have gone through the roof, and partly because of government global warming schemes that have shut down half a dozen coal-fired power stations and forced us to use instead more expensive wind and solar power. Now, with people getting crosser and crosser, the Turnbull government, in response, has developed a policy that it calls the National Energy Guarantee. But I would guarantee there'd be hardly a voter that understands it. Lucky for the government. This National Energy Guarantee, among other things, will force our 100 biggest electricity users not just to keep cutting the carbon dioxide emissions that are blamed for dangerous global warming, but to also arrange for their own alternative energy supplies to kick in when the wind farms have no wind or the solar farms have no sun. And the government somehow claims that this will cut prices as well as emissions. Win-win. But what counts most for the government? You see, the government really, really wants to cut emissions because of this Paris Agreement. And we're back to that topic. Under this agreement, signed by the world, Australia has agreed to cuts, even though our emissions are actually tiny, just 1.3% of the world's. We've agreed to make these very expensive cuts, even though this Paris Agreement doesn't force any of the world's top 3 emitters to do the same. China, the world's biggest emitter by far, is allowed to nearly double its own emissions. How crazy is that? India, it can increase its own as well. As for the United States, well, President Donald Trump says the Paris deal's a con and has torn it up. America has walked out. But there's the Turnbull government. There's little Australia. Still saying, hey, let's keep cutting our emissions, regardless almost of the cost. And it's cut them with this National Energy Guarantee. Look, this is so dumb. Anyway, a number of Liberal and National MPs are now saying, wait a minute. Yes, this guarantee will cut emissions, but will it actually cut prices? I mean, cutting prices is what you're after, isn't it? But even the main designer of this policy, the head of the Energy Security Board, suggests it's not really going to do that at all, no matter what the government says.
Guarantee is about providing a reliable power system and meeting the emissions targets set in the Paris Agreement. I don't think anybody can guarantee a price reduction about anything, actually, because what happens with prices depends on too many things.
So I can understand coalition MPs now thinking, is this National Energy Guarantee just a con by the Prime Minister, who they know is a global warming true believer? I mean, they remember what Malcolm Turnbull vowed 9 years ago when he was sacked, back then as the Liberal leader, replaced by Tony Abbott, for wanting to back Labor's plans for a kind of carbon tax back then.
I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am.
And so it has now proved, now that Turnbull is back as Liberal leader and now Prime Minister. He is giving us a kind of carbon tax after all. And Tony Abbott, who as Prime Minister scrapped Labor's carbon tax, has had enough. And he is right. I spoke to him a short while ago. Tony Abbott, thank you so much indeed for your time. What do you plan to say in tonight's speech?
Well, what I'm going to say, Andrew, is that the National Energy Guarantee is not about reducing prices, it's about reducing emissions. It's all about reducing emissions because that's what our Paris targets are all about, and given that, I think the best thing we can do right now is pull out of the Paris Agreement.
Pull out of the Paris Agreement. Now, this is the agreement signed. A lot of countries agreed to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide, which they claim is heating the world dangerously. It didn't bind China, the world's biggest emitter, to cuts. Didn't bind India, the third biggest.
And now it doesn't bind America.
Which has walked out.
Exactly right.
Why do you think we should walk out?
Well, if we had known then what we know now about America's withdrawal, about the economic damage that renewable energy in particular would do to our power system and to our industries, we would never have signed up. And now that we do know, we should get out. Simple as that.
But people will say, listen, global warming is a problem and it would be irresponsible and reckless for Australia to pull out of commitments to cut its emissions. We don't want to be wreckers.
I'm not going to get bogged down in arguments over the science because, or the so-called science, because I'm not a scientist, as is well known, Andrew. But if you believe the chief scientist, he said that our efforts will achieve virtually nothing. So the problem with our emissions reduction targets as they stand is that not only are they doing massive damage to people's cost of living, not only are they threatening industries and jobs, but in terms of climate, even if you accept the science, they're utterly futile. That's why I say let's pull out.
But wouldn't the world react strongly if, or the Western world react strongly if we did so by imposing maybe tariffs, for instance? Or
they haven't done that to the United States, and I don't believe that they would target us, given that they didn't target America. I think if we were to do this, we would more likely have people saying, well, thank God there's another country that is prepared to put the cost of living, the standard of living of its own people and the protection of its own jobs ahead of green ideology.
So the knock on you, whenever you suggest anything in this area, is, well, you agree to the Paris agreements and poor old Malcolm Turnbull, well, he just went along with what you've done.
Let's remember that what my government agreed to was a target, not a commitment, not a binding commitment, an aspirational target in 15 years' time. It was essentially a wait-and-see policy, wait and see what other countries would really do, wait and see what was really happening on the ground. What we've seen is no particular change to climate over the last few years, but we have seen massive damage to cost of living and to jobs and to industries. That's why the point I make is that climate change may or may not do us harm in the long-term future, but I tell you what, climate change policy is doing us a lot of harm right now. That's why it needs to change, and the best way to change it is to pull out of Paris, because it's Paris which is driving the so-called National Energy Guarantee. Again, I stress, it's not a price reduction policy, it's an emissions reduction policy. If it was a price reduction policy, there would be a price target in it and not just an emissions target.
Yes, there's an emissions target, there are reliability guarantees, but there are no guarantees to cut prices, which I thought was the whole point of it. One thing I don't understand at all about the National Energy Guarantee is exactly how it is meant to cut prices. I mean, there's loose talk about, oh, we'll give an investment guarantee so people can finally start investing in coal-fired power stations. But at the same time, the woman who's most responsible for designing it says, well, she can't expect any coal-fired operators to invest in Australia anyway. So I don't get that. But tell me the link between your plan to scrap emissions targets and suddenly we get cheaper electricity prices.
Well, I'm saying let's not do any further damage. I'm not guaranteeing that prices are going to fall tomorrow. What I'm trying to do is to guarantee that there will not be any more policy-inflicted damage, that we won't be doing ourselves any more self-harm. And the problem is, if we stick with the national energy guarantee, so-called, we're going to have higher emissions reduction targets, we're going to have more renewable energy, and over time we're going to have a lot less coal-fired power in the system, and we know that this is the cheapest form of baseload power. How do we know, Andrew? Because our thermal coal exports keep going up and up and up. Now, how can people say credibly that coal is uneconomic when our coal exports keep going up and up and up? They're not being stockpiled, they're being used by people who know that coal is the cheapest form of reliable 24/7 baseload power.
That's right. Coal exports are predicted to raise a record $60 billion this financial year from government figures. That bit's true, but I can't see how you can stop people from wanting to cut emissions unless you do what you said you didn't want to do, and that is question the global warming science. If we actually start, well, the global warming science, I'm falling into the trap of the preachers. There are lots of scientists with lots of views, and some of them say our emissions aren't heating the world as was predicted, and therefore they don't see a climate emergency. Do you think those scientists are right?
Well, Andrew, again, I'm going to try to avoid getting into...
I don't know how you can. You have to.
But the chief scientist himself...
You won't win the argument.
Andrew, the chief scientist himself, who does subscribe to the so-called science, says that even if we completely eliminate Australia's emissions, the impact on climate will be virtually nothing. They're not my words, they're his words. So my point is that by going further down the path we're currently on, not only are we doing ourselves harm, but it is absolutely futile in terms of climate change. Now, why would you do yourself harm for no good end?
I've been asking that question since before you were a Prime Minister, and I've never got an answer from any Prime Minister, including when you were in office. I mean, people dance around this. I mean, the political damage of questioning this is just so high.
But we know more now, Andrew. You were perhaps right before your time. Now that we know more, we can do differently.
Before
it's
I move
the old
off
story, Andrew. When circumstances change, you change your position, you change your mind, and we know a lot more about the damage that climate change policy can do after the South Australian statewide blackout and the subsequent rationing that we've inflicted upon users of energy such as the Tomago aluminium smelter. And our 2015 agreement was expressly subject to all parties being in it. It had to be applicable to all. And when the world's leading nation, the United States, pulls out, that obviously changes a lot.
I'm going to ask one more question before I move on that issue about the global warming. Put it this way. What have you seen to suggest that global warming is inflicting problems on us? Because the Bureau of Meteorology says we're getting fewer cyclones, including fewer severe cyclones. The dams have not drained, like Tim Flannery predicted, the former Chief Climate Commissioner. Our crops are setting records.
Our droughts
what have you seen?
Are not more severe, our floods are not bigger, our storms are not worse.
Can you name a single thing?
Nothing that we have seen over the last century suggests that anything dramatic is happening. That said, I'd rather stick with the position of the chief scientist, which is that nothing that we do to our emissions is going to make any difference. And why do something, even in a good cause, that is absolutely futile? We shouldn't be in the business of making destructive moral gestures.
9 years ago, when you toppled Malcolm Turnbull as Liberal leader, the issue then was the carbon tax, or effectively a form of carbon emission trading scheme that he wanted your party to agree to. This was Kevin Rudd's emissions trading scheme. You said no, the party agreed with you, you campaigned against the carbon tax, you won the election, you abolished the tax, scrapped the tax. Do you think Malcolm Turnbull, who vowed then that he would never lead a Liberal Party unless it was as serious about global warming as he was, is bringing back a form of carbon tax?
Well, certainly, Andrew, the wheel does seem to have turned full circle. Back in late 2009, Malcolm Turnbull was trying to do a deal with the Labor Party to cut emissions, and again he's trying to do a deal with the Labor Party via COAG to cut emissions. I think the important thing is to ensure that our economy is strong. I'm not against cutting emissions, but I am against cutting emissions at the expense of your standard of living and your job. And that's my position now. That was my position then. But there is absolutely no doubt, as Paul Keating once said, you change the leader, you change the party.
But how does it work, right? You go to an election saying, axe the carbon tax. Your party's right behind you. You win an election on it. Your party votes to scrap the carbon tax. And now you're telling me the same party is meekly sitting by as Malcolm Turnbull introduces a carbon tax. Explain to me that process.
Well, I'm not sure, Andrew, that people are meekly sitting by.
Well, the last time you guys talked about this in your party room, 4 people got up, including you. Only 4. 4 MPs.
Well, Andrew, my job, my duty, is to call it as I see it. One of the good things about being on the backbench is that our party gives backbenchers a certain freedom to speak their mind and even, if necessary, to cross the floor. And I am going to exercise the freedom of the backbench to say what I think needs to be said. And, you know, in the end, Andrew, people should be in public life, not for position, but for principle.
And if the government persists on this emissions trade, what is it? I'm getting confused with the various names of these things. They all amount to the same thing. This National Energy Guarantee, you'd vote against it in Parliament.
There are certain ways that it could be improved, but as things stand, I couldn't support it now.
Would you be alone in crossing the floor?
Well, let's wait and see. I think a number of my colleagues have very deep concerns, but let's just wait and see how things develop in the next few weeks.
Tony Abbott, why do you bother? Because listen, mate, I can write the headlines myself right now about what's tomorrow. You know, Tony Abbott, the wrecker. Tony Abbott shows us a crazy. Tony Abbott, the climate denier.
And the point I keep making, Andrew, is that people who have concerns about this policy are not trying to wreck the government. We are trying to save it.
That's not how Malcolm Turnbull will perceive it. That's not how his people will brief it. They will point to you as a wrecker.
And Andrew, I don't say anything in private that I don't say in public. And let me say it again, right on the record, people who have concerns about the energy policy of the government are not trying to wreck it. They're trying to save it by giving us a policy which is different from Labor's, significantly different from Labor's, but which also delivers to voters what they want most, which is affordable, reliable power.
And if the government gets its way, they brush you aside. The Michael Photius forces in the Liberal Party will try to strip you of your pre-selection at Warringah.
Well, I'm not sure that they will, but...
They'll try. Let me tell you, they'll try. And you know that. They're already going for Craig Kelly, for instance, as another person.
That's a whole different ball game. But the point, as I say, Andrew, is...
Makes me wonder why you bother, to be honest. But anyway, there you go.
But Andrew, you go into public life to make a difference. not to be ambitious for the higher job, but to be ambitious for the higher things. And that's what I hope I've always sought to do, to try to make a difference and to put principle before position.
Can I just switch before we go? Last question, just idle speculation. I'm talking about another politician that the media... I mean, the media's really gone for you. I mean, you haven't got many friends in the media outside some 2GB and Sky, a couple of people, I guess, but basically you're a media pinata. Another one like that is Donald Trump. Looking back at what Donald Trump's achieved, despite the amazing ferocity of the media campaign against him, what do you conclude?
Look, even as an ex-Prime Minister, I'm not in the business of being critical of the leader of the free world, and for better or for worse, the President of the United States is the leader of the free world. So I'm not going to be critical of Donald Trump. I am not going to praise everything he's done, but the interesting thing about Trump is that he has done almost exactly what he said he would do. He said he'd build a wall, and he's doing his best. He said he'd cut taxes, and he has. He said he'd pull out of Paris, and he has. He said he'd stop the Iran deal, and he did. He said he'd move the embassy to Jerusalem, and he has. He said he'd build up the defence forces, and that's happening. He said he'd pull out of the TPP, and he has. Not necessarily such a great move, but nevertheless, the thing that characterises Donald Trump is that, so far at least, he has been absolutely true to his word, or certainly as consistent as any politician that I can remember.
Seeing how smashed through the media war against him, and I don't think it's too exaggerated word, a media war against him, won the presidency, and now his approval ratings are about where Barack Obama's were, according to the Rasmussen poll, at the same period of his thing. Do you look back and think, I could have learned from Donald Trump's way of handling the media. I should have done X and X when it comes to handling a media that's pretty uniformly hostile. What do you think?
Look, Andrew, there are always things that you could have done differently and better.
Leave aside the differently, but right now you think, I wish I could have, that's something I'll remember.
And I made a resolution to myself when I went back onto the backbench that I would speak my mind, and that's exactly what I've done.
Tony Abbott, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
The Vault Report.